Alright! Welcome to Rockstar! Now, just so you all know, we're gonna cover this topic as fast and as completely as we can. Just the way you like it. Thanks for watching!
Chapter 1. The book you shouldn't read. Everyone is talking about this book that just came out. Some parents are all upset that their kid was assigned to read this book in school. Some teachers have gotten into big trouble for assigning it to their students. Other teachers have gotten fired. Some principals are demanding that the libraries take the book off the shelves. So of course, this is the book you want to read. If you're a teen in the 1950s or 60s, J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye is like nothing you've ever read. It's narrated in the first person by a 16-year-old named Holden Caulfield, who really sounds like how your friends talk, and who really thinks the way teens like you think. He's sarcastic and weird, but he seems happy about being weird. He talks about all kinds of random thoughts that pass through his brain. He curses like crazy. He drinks alcohol and smokes cigarettes and talks about sex a lot. And to top it all off, he just got kicked out of prep school. For some reason, a lot of adults don't think this stuff is appropriate reading for students like you. Since it came out in 1951, The Catcher in the Rye has been one of the most popular and also one of the most frequently banned books in America. One really outraged dude actually counted the curses and said the novel contains 785 swear words. People were really freaked out by the author's use of crude, profane, and obscene language. They demanded that it be taken off the shelves because they felt the book attacked values like patriotism, religion, education, and things they thought students should be taught to respect. But by no means does that mean the book doesn't have value. In fact, if you look through history, you'll find that many banned books are some of the most important and interesting. Beyond Holden's so-called inappropriate, sulky, and swear-filled behavior, it's also important to view him through the context of when his story was originally published. Nowadays, we might think of the 60s and just think of hippies. But hippies were just a small part of a youthful and progressive culture where people decided that the old rules weren't fair, and that the old ways didn't make sense anymore. Many teens and college students of that decade really started questioning the way their parents' generation was living their lives, and they started to rebel against what their parents and other adults in charge expected from them. Young people began fighting back and questioning the rules. This was the beginning of the counterculture movement and the anti-establishment movement. They wore buttons with the slogan saying, "Don't trust anyone over 30 or question authority." This was the generation that also started fighting for civil rights for African Americans and protesting the Vietnam War. You see, in the late 1960s, men as young as 18 were drafted to fight in the Vietnam War, and tons of them got killed. If your friends or your brothers were getting killed because your government made them go fight in a war you didn't even believe in, wouldn't you be motivated to take a stand? If you saw racism and discrimination protected by law everywhere you turned, wouldn't you want to change things and demand civil rights? The current events these teens were surrounded with inspired them to grow up fast and to challenge authority. And honestly, how different is this from the world you live in now? Back in 1942, when J.D. Salinger was 23, he was drafted to fight in an earlier war, World War II. The year before the war started, Salinger wrote a short story about Holden Caulfield, a mopey teenager who was the blueprint for the Catcher in the Rye's Holden Caulfield. The story, which was a slight rebellion off Madison, was accepted to be published in the New Yorker magazine. That's a very big deal. But when the war started, the magazine's editors decided it wasn't very appropriate to publish a story like this. America was going to fight the Nazis, and the country was pulling together. It's not a very good time to print a story about a young guy who was gloomy and negative about everything. But this character stayed on Salinger's mind, and 5 years after the war was over, he published The Catcher in the Rye. Holden was perfect for this generation of readers. He was a smart, lonely, depressed, sarcastic teenager. He couldn't relate to most of the people he met and felt different from everyone around him. He refused to play by the rules. He thought the rules weren't even fair. He didn't trust adults, and he thought most people were phony, just a bunch of fakers. So The Catcher in the Rye captured the spirit of the era from the 50s to the 60s and onwards, and became a book that reflected every generation of young people who felt like adults just didn't get them. Holden is similar to his creator in many ways. Holden is a misanthrope, a word that technically means he's a hater, someone who just hates people. But when people say it nowadays, they often mean someone who just doesn't connect to others, someone who doesn't want to fit in because they're critical about a lot of human behavior. J.D. Salinger was very much a hermit and a misanthrope himself. He never published anything after 1965, and even though he wrote many other stories, including one about Holden's brother Allie, Salinger simply refused to publish them. In fact, despite his fame and success for Catcher and a few other novels, he completely withdrew from public life. He never wanted his picture taken. He never wanted to give interviews, and he filed lawsuits against people who wanted to write about him or his characters. He even threw rocks at reporters who tried to approach his house. By the time he died in 2010, he'd been out of the public eye for decades and decades. It's really interesting that a recluse like Salinger was able to create such a rich and relatable character. A character who was relatable because he couldn't relate to anyone. Holden tells us his story from a sanitarium, a place where people go to recover from illness. But when Holden mentions seeing a therapist, it becomes clear that at least some of his problems are mental. He tells us about a few days he spent wandering around New York, just before Christmas, in the late 1940s. We learn that Holden's little brother Allie died 3 years ago, and as Holden tells his story, we quickly see how sad this still makes him. He discusses being kicked out of school and going back to Manhattan to hang out until it was time to go home and face his parents. He meets a few people and has conversations along the way, but honestly, Holden doesn't do a whole lot in terms of action-packed adventures. However, the book isn't necessarily about what Holden does. It lets us observe how Holden's mind works and what he's thinking about. It lets us in on his special inner monologue, the voice that has captured the minds of young adults around the world. If anything, the book is focused much more on his internal thoughts than his external actions. As Holden slowly meanders through Manhattan, from hotels to bars to museums and up and down Fifth Avenue, from a skating rink to Central Park, the reader is able to connect the dots between these days spent wandering the city and the bed Holden lies in now. We get to know him as he faces adults whom he calls big faking phonies, and as he treasures the pure innocence of children. We learn about him as he mourns his brother and flounders about the city in perpetual loneliness. And we love him for struggling with the same thing all young adults struggle with, sooner or later, coming of age and growing up.
Well, alright! We hope you enjoyed that! You just did it! The first chapter of the topic! Now, just so you know, there are 4 more chapters to go in this app, and it will only take you about 45 more minutes to complete, and you are totally done! Now check this out! The app also comes with about 15 pages of analysis and summary that you can download and use any way you need to. Here's what you got to do.